guys, welcome back, or if this is your first time here, then thank you for joining us. This is the Doula's Guide to ... with me, Meg, also known as the Dungaree Doula, the podcast where we talk about all things pregnancy, birth and postpartum, sharing unbiased information to ensure you go into birth feeling confident in the informed choices you've made for yourself and your babe. If you missed the first few episodes and would like to know more about me, then go and check out episode 1 for a little introduction and a big chat on hypnobirthing, and the following episodes for some great birth preparation. This episode, I am so excited because we've finally got our first episode with a guest. So my wonderful guest today is Deva, also known as Braw Birth. Deva's a queer fertility and birth doula based in Glasgow, but she offers virtual support across the UK alongside a wide range of workshops and CPD for fellow doulas too. In this episode, we chat about what fertility support can look like and why you may need to access it, some of the barriers faced when accessing fertility support, how the journey might feel. We chat about legalities around fertility, the emotional aspect and how this might impact pregnancy and parenting journeys, as well as some of Deva's personal lived experiences, and much, much more. So I really hope you enjoy it, and let's get into it. Right, perfect. So thank you for coming onto the podcast. To start off with, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what you do, first of all?
Yeah, of course. So hi everyone, I'm Deva and I run a service called Braw Birth, and it's a queer fertility and birth service based in Glasgow, but I offer UK-wide support.
Perfect, thank you. And so how did you sort of find your niche as this? So did you want to become a doula at first, or was it your experiences that led you to sort of creating the specific like queer fertility support side of it? How did you come to that?
Yeah, so I suppose just before the pandemic hit, I live with arthritis and I had like a full-time job. I was really struggling to keep up in that job, so I took a bit of a career break after I got married in 2019, and I'd always been interested in like birth and maternity, but obviously due to having quite a limiting condition, it never really felt like an option for me. And for the first year of the kind of break that I was taking in the pandemic, I just took a complete break for myself. And then just by chance, I was following Freddie McConnell online because my husband is trans, so that's kind of where my interest in fertility comes from and how we were thinking of setting up our family. And I saw one of the evenings that he was doing a masterclass with Jen Muir, and I just happened to click into that link and saw this like amazing course that I'd never really thought about before, but doula work suddenly seemed like an avenue that I could kind of get into where it would help me in my condition and it would still allow me to work in the areas that I was interested in. And then to find such an inclusive course really felt like a good idea. And then just by an amazing coincidence, that was like the 2 weeks that the applications were open. So I put through an application and managed to get on the course just by like kind of a huge coincidence. And then I suppose my interest in fertility came then from obviously doing like the pregnancy doula course. And then when we finished that, I didn't really know. I've never been self-employed before. I didn't really know what I was doing. So I started to get coaching with Mars Lord, and she was kind of coaching me through a lot of stuff, and I wasn't very confident, and the kind of things I think made me quite unique or would give me a niche, I was kind of hiding away from. And I was telling her that I was going through my own fertility journey with my husband, and she was like, well, why don't you use that? Like, why don't you provide that support that is obviously needed? So that's kind of how that side of it came to be. And I do offer pregnancy support, but I suppose a lot of where I'm working in and where my interest lies is in that queer fertility support, because I think it is so needed for the community. And with COVID as well, like my own fertility journey has been held back by 2 or 3 years from when I thought I would be trying to now just starting to try. So it's definitely had a knock-on effect, and I don't really know of many other people who are offering the same kind of support that I'm offering. So yeah, that's kind of where my interest has come from for it.
Yeah, because I can't think of anyone else offering this sort of support. Like, I mean, maybe there is someone out there somewhere, but there's no one else that I've seen that's offering, especially specifically around like queer fertility journeys and stuff. I've occasionally seen like people offering fertility services, but not specifically for queer people or anyone in this sort of space. So
I suppose like where I was seeing it was like I see a lot of people offer fertility support, but it's not queer focused.
Yeah.
And then I see a lot of amazing queer practitioners offer pregnancy and birth support and that kind of side of things, but nobody was really talking about the preconception phase or your journey to conception. And like when myself and my husband, it must have been like a year and a half ago, but when we were kind of at the stage of being referred to for the clinic and going through initial tests, we were offered support from a psychologist there, and she was just kind of saying that nobody, whether you're queer or not, talks about how you conceived or if you ever struggled to conceive. And when I've done like surveys on my Instagram stories and stuff, the majority of people were saying, yeah, I did struggle to conceive, or it was harder for me. Nobody talks about it. And also in like potentially having to get assisted support for fertility, it changes how people experience their pregnancy and their postpartum and parenting journey, and nobody really talks about that. So for anybody who's had any assisted conception, then going into mainstream services like antenatal care or maternity, it feels very different, or you kind of feel like you're kind of on the cusp or on the outside because you maybe have more anxiety around your pregnancy or PTSD from the treatment itself that can kind of rear up. So yeah, I think it's been really interesting to figure out that people's journeys are so different, and I offer training as well for doulas to look at that, and it's been really interesting for me to kind of look into that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, like you say, yeah, it's not something that is really taken into consideration. I know that I've had like doula clients before that have just booked me and like not ever said anything on like their booking forms, and then maybe like 2 or 3 appointments in, it's come out that actually it's taken them like years to get to this point, or that they've suffered lots of losses or things like that. But like they've not thought to mention it to me at the beginning, because I guess they just don't expect to, because they don't think that like where's that space for them to talk about it, basically. And then it's come up and I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, like I had no idea that this had been going on, because I don't know if sometimes maybe I am naive about it and I just think like, oh, everyone's had my experience of just like not ever struggling with this, and then it gets into it and you realise actually, God, you've been through it to get to this point.
I suppose like nobody really talks about their conception journey.
No.
And I don't think it's like people being naive or like ignorant to not ask, because then a lot of people just, it's very hidden and it's very secretive and you don't really talk about it. Or like what my experience with my husband, and particularly being in a queer relationship, because we're both LGBT, not a lot of our friends aren't conceiving at the same time. So I'm noticing with a lot of our cis and heterosexual friends, they're maybe all starting to start their families in around the same time. So they've got peers that have either been through postpartum at the same time or are pregnant at the same time. But for us, we're kind of doing it alone. And then your friends don't really know what to ask or how to ask things. So it can be quite isolating. And then with clients that I have or people that are interested in the service, it's the same for them when I'm checking in about their social networks. They're like, none of our friends are trying at this point either. So I think it can be quite isolating. And then I suppose when I'm thinking about my paperwork and being a doula, for my pregnancy paperwork as well, I specifically put in a question on how somebody's conception journey went, even if they've not come to me for fertility. And with the doula training I offer as well, part of that training is looking at I think it's 25 things that you can do with your practice to show that consideration or those little changes, where it starts up that conversation. And I also offer queer antenatal education, and a whole session on that program is dedicated to just allowing people to have the space to talk about it, because some people, this is where it can feel daunting with fertility as well, because some people can go into fertility and they get pregnant within the first cycle or the second cycle of treatment. And other people I know have had to wait for like 6 years, or they've not been able to conceive, and they've had to look down other routes. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions as well, is a lot of people think, and this is something that the clinic had to speak to us about, but we kind of had an awareness, but a lot of people assume that if you're going through fertility treatment, that there's going to be a pregnancy or a baby at the end of it, and that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
Sometimes there won't be, and it won't be successful, and you might have to look at other avenues, or like go through that loss and grieving stage that you're not going to have the family that you expected. And I think there can be that toxic positivity thing with pregnancy as well, of like, oh, well, you'll definitely get pregnant, or you should just be trying this, or I've heard this, this, and this from this person, and that can put a lot of pressure on, or like that sense of loss as well. And just people don't know how to talk about it, or there's so many misconceptions that people have about fertility treatment itself, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I think it is one of those things that we don't talk about it at all. No one knows about it. No one talks about it, so no one knows what to say. So when you do come across like a client, or just somebody that you're talking to, someone like an associate, you don't. I mean, obviously you do, but for most of us, like we don't know what to say. We're on our tiptoes around it, because like you say, you don't know what the end of it's going to look like. You don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know what people have been through previously to get to this point that they're at already. So it is a sensitive topic. So as a fertility doula, how do you sort of outline your role, or is it completely individualised for every person that you see?
I think it's I think when I first started and I hadn't had my own lived experience yet, or I was kind of looking at other doulas models and being like, okay, well, this makes sense. And I was just offering 3 months of support with like weekly sessions with me at a certain price. And then looking at the system as well, sometimes you can be waiting from across the UK, it can take 3 months to 3 years to then be seen by the clinic.
Right.
So it didn't really feel like that fit in with people's lived experience or what they might need. So I think I just started to set up a model of, I now offer models of 3, 6, 12, and 18 months. So it's kind of like the shorter ones are probably the more intensive periods of maybe you've gone through like multiple cycles or losses, or you've had to come to terms with potentially having to go down the IVF route, and kind of having that quite intensive emotional support. And then as they get kind of longer, the 18-month one might be more so, okay, you've definitely got onto the referral list and you're probably going to start treatment in the next 6 months. So let's meet up every month and just have that support for you in place. But I think a lot of the things that I see with fertility support and fertility coaching, where I think trying to be a fertility doula is kind of different. And I've seen a lot of fertility doulas in, say, America, but I haven't really been able to find another person that would identify as a fertility doula like myself in Scotland or kind of in the UK.
Yeah.
But I kind of take it very similar model to like the pregnancy doula role of like working and providing like evidence-based information, more probably around the context of like fertility education, but really looking at it from like that emotional and physical and informational support throughout the whole process. So you're kind of bringing like evidence-based education, connection, empathy, advocacy as well, because that can be a huge thing where sometimes you kind of feel like you're just on this conveyor belt, and kind of knowing what your rights are, being like, you can say no to those things, or you don't have to just go along with things, or you can look at other options, and that kind of holistic care as well, because the whole, I'm finding, and what I'm hearing from other queer people, is the whole process can be very clinical. It's kind of, it's very clinical, and then a lot of information that you can be given is done sometimes in a very cold, matter-of-fact delivery. Because if you think about it, doctors and nurses are telling this kind of information to people every day.
Yeah.
And I think with like issues with like the NHS and funding and everything, and then like medical burnout, you're just kind of told things quite matter-of-factly. And even when we were accessing like the therapy support before starting the treatment, the therapist's attitude was just kind of like, well, that's just the way it is. And myself and Bradley were like, we know that's the way it is, but could you talk us through how we can deal with that emotionally? Because I think it's different now, but when we were prepping for fertility, we were going to be separated. So Riley wasn't able to come with me to the clinic for any appointment. So he could come with me, but he wasn't allowed through the doors. And I was kind of saying, but even if we've had all of our jabs, or even for the moments of like conception where we would be using like the donor sperm, can Riley be in the room? And they were just like, no, he'll have to just stay outside. And because obviously that was a systemic thing we were going to completely respect, but the kind of attitude was just like, well, that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
But that's obviously going to have a huge emotional toll. And for people like for Riley, because we've decided to use donor sperm rather than use like reciprocal IVF, he was already kind of feeling quite separated from the whole thing. So that was kind of difficult. So that's kind of where a lot of that support comes in. Then like providing emotional support, I suppose there's the added support that you're like, I also kind of can support people if they're a single parent. I've had one or two people contact me that way to be like, I'd really like to try to conceive. I'm not with anybody, but could you come with me or give me that added support at appointments? And you're also helping people to not feel like burdened, pressured, or like left behind in the process, particularly like if they're the non-bio parent. And you're kind of helping couples or single parents like manage a whole range of emotions, because you don't know how you're going to feel. Or particularly with couples as well, one of the biggest things is remembering for each other that you're both probably going to have different emotional reactions at different stages.
Yeah.
So you're kind of there to kind of help them still feel connected or like regulated together. I suppose they're kind of like the main things. And then for like the physical support, obviously I can go and be there at fertility clinic appointments with people, whether that's I'm actually attending the appointment as well, or being in the hospital to kind of check in after, or like doing text or like phone support or like Zoom support. I provide like checklists of things to have for an appointment or like aftercare, because I don't think many people think of that either. If you've gone through certain procedures, it's a very tiring process, particularly on a procedure day. So like you have to track your ovulation. Then if you're at a peak, you have to phone before 7:45 in the morning for my clinic. Then you come in, they'll do a blood test to confirm your LH is like up.
Yeah.
And then they'll be like, okay, yeah, you're ovulating. Go, like for me, it would be like, okay, go back to work or go home. And then they'll call you, and then they'll be like, yes, so you have to come in at 3:00 that same day to then go through the procedure. So it can be very tiring.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're like a couple who both works, to kind of coordinate that as well. And then obviously it could be quite, I don't necessarily think it's painful, but it can be quite uncomfortable. So thinking about those aftercare things of looking at, I can also like help with a bit of meal prepping if that's what they need, or like just reminding them of those things of like, hey, maybe set aside some cash so you can get a takeaway that night so you don't have that pressure to cook, and just remember to look after yourself. And clinics are quite good. They can give a letter for your employer to say, hey, they may need to go to an appointment quite last minute, but just remembering like maybe if you need to work back some time, don't feel like you have to do it that same day. Maybe work an extra hour like for a few days after. And then I suppose, it's kind of like being able to be there to debrief as well, because you're being told so much information and sometimes in a matter-of-fact way. So having that, I suppose, like a birth doula would do, to be like, okay, that's a lot to process. how are you feeling about that? Like, how do you want to proceed? Probably is like a huge thing. And I suppose like why I probably set up the service and why I felt like it was needed, as we kind of said before, it is really isolating and nobody really talks about it. So kind of having that added doula support, and particularly with queer fertility doula stuff, which is why I kind of want to help that clientele the most, is that you know that you're getting doulas with like the same values and the same lived experience, so they can help you kind of feel more like grounded or connected or informed throughout the whole process, because sometimes it just feels like you're just on this conveyor belt and so much stuff around it. It's just assumed that you'll know all this information already. And I've been studying it for the last year and a half, and I still have to ask questions or get told different things from different nurses, so it can be quite overwhelming, I think, as well.
Yeah, no, I bet God, I had no idea about how that happens on the day that you have to ring up so early in the morning and just literally basically be on call for the day. That's wild.
I don't know if it's changed, but I thought it was like, oh, you go in, you get your blood checked, and then they're like, okay, you'll be booked in, just sit and wait, and we'll call you in like half an hour. I didn't realise I'd have to go home and come back hours later. Like,
so what you're offering is sort of like it is completely individualised for, it's like, I guess, the emotional, holistic, individualised support that people are, just not getting when they're actually seeing the medical professionals, which, I guess is similar to a pregnancy doula, I guess, but it's more all-encompassing, it sounds like, for fertility.
Yeah, and I think hopefully if I can get this like fertility doula stuff off the ground, like my plan would be to train other people to become fertility doulas as well. But like the biggest comments that I get from queer people and anybody that's gone through fertility support is kind of saying, oh my God, I wish Braw Birth existed when I was starting my family, because you're kind of just left completely alone to go through this whole process. And then there's the added difficulty as well that if you do manage to conceive, there's no real transition period. You've maybe been with this clinic for like 6 months, a year, maybe multiple years, and then it's kind of like, okay, bye, go into the maternity system.
I had a client who had she was a single parent and she'd gone through IVF, and they basically just like dropped her off, and then she was under the midwives, and then at one point she randomly got a consultant that she just like, he just rung her out of the blue, and she was like, oh, now I'm under consult. Like, she knew she was gonna be, but she'd not had any sort of crossover, like forewarning, nothing, and then all of a sudden she was like, right, okay, you're my consultant, let's explain everything that's happened to you. And there was absolutely no crossover, no chat or anything between them.
Because when we had some issues with the therapist that we got through the NHS, so we decided to stop seeing them and to pay for a queer therapist ourselves. But when we were speaking to her, say, last year, to be like, so if we get pregnant, can we still speak to you about how that pregnancy feels or whatever? And she's like, no, you're not part of the service anymore, so you're just going to go into maternity. And I was like, okay, that feels like a lot.
Yeah, and especially because nowadays there's so much chat about continuity of care during pregnancy. Surely that extends even more so for people who have had this sort of tumultuous journey to get to that point. Surely you would think that would be incredibly important for people to have some sort of like stable continuity.
Yeah,
you would think.
I think it's kind of difficult because I think maybe it's the same with like the emotional experience with pregnancy after fertility, and it's maybe reflected in the system. But a lot of people say, which I think is why like high levels of perinatal anxiety and perinatal depression is so high among people who have had to use it like assisted conception support, particularly going into the first trimester of pregnancy, because you're kind of met with a lot of toxic positivity, or everybody's then so excited that you're pregnant, and a lot of people are like, okay, I feel happy that I'm pregnant, but I'm so anxious that something's going to go wrong, and I went through all this shit to get here, and now I've got nobody to speak to about it. And then unless you've got proper support of like fertility support groups or other people that you know, you've kind of got the system being like, oh, it's so great that you're pregnant, bye. And then people around you being like, oh my God, but you're pregnant. You must be so excited. You must be so grateful. And a lot of people's lived experiences like, I don't know how to feel about this, or I feel burnt out. And now I'm going straight into maternity where there's like systemic issues there. And then there's like that thing where you're usually already categorized as like being a high risk client, which mightn't necessarily be the case.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like stuck in that system and don't really know where to go or where to process things, I think, as well.
Yeah, it's really hard, but I mean, that speaks sort of testament to your role and why it is so important, because no one else is doing it. But that kind of leads me on to my next question, because I wanted to say, like, why do you think that there is such a gap in the market for this? Because I've seen a couple of fertility doulas in America, but a lot of the time when I see people talking about fertility within their birth work or within their doula work, it's more support with getting pregnant that people offer, and it'll be things like, we offer sometimes really random stuff, like we offer like moon circles and like, and I'm not downplaying things like that, but sometimes I see people and that's all that they're like, oh, I'm trained in fertility, and they're doing like fertility yoga and stuff like that, but they're not offering anything else aside from that. That's the only sort of things I ever see about fertility, it feels like, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some absolutely amazing people that do fertility support in the UK that aren't necessarily fertility doulas. There are a lot of fertility coaches,
right?
And I don't necessarily know fully what certain people do, but I suppose for me and my standpoint of it, like you were saying, of like people being like, okay, well, we're going to get you pregnant and we're going to do this, and I know maybe a lot of fertility coaches that I've heard of as well have maybe been nurses before or come from that medical background, so they're like, we'll get your blood tested and we'll look at this and we'll look at all your levels. And from my experience of fertility, I don't want any of that. I'm kind of having an okay experience so far with the fertility clinics, but if it were to feel difficult, or I was to come across like microaggressions or not feeling like I could advocate for myself, I don't really know if I want that motivational, like, okay, well, let's look at this and let's look at this.
Yeah.
I kind of just want somebody to be like, it's kind of shit, isn't it? Like, it's really shit, or it's really tiring, or I'm sorry that happened, or let's look at how we could do this. And I think specifically for queer people as well, a lot of the fertility coaches, and for a lot of cis and heterosexual people in fertility, which I think is why it's such a big discrepancy, and why I think queer fertility support is so needed, is like, that those couples may need assisted conception support, but they still have some option. Not in all the times, but there is some still kind of chance where they can still try to conceive at home. They can still sleep with their partner and potentially get pregnant, or depending on what the medical issue is, they could still be given certain medication to like boost their ovulation and still try at home. Whereas for a lot of queer people, and particularly for like my situation, or for same-sex female couples, we're completely reliant on the clinic. And I think that's where the frustration lies as well for a lot of queer fertility as well. Sometimes there's no medical need and there's no medical issue. You just need, it's called social infertility, which is like a great phrase. But like for myself and Riley, so far from all the tests that I've had done, there is no medical need for me to need fertility support.
Yeah.
But we need to use a donor. So we need to go down those avenues for that. Like we wanted to go down those avenues for that added safety of it being regulated, and for like all the legal things to be covered. But then that's where it gets frustrating, where you're like, oh, like we've been waiting for 2.5 years, and then my BMI meant that we were like struck off for a good few months until I could get it down again. But because it's been such a long wait for some queer people as well, and they don't have that option to try independently of the clinic too, it can put a lot of pressure on. And I think that can be quite like a big barrier. I think there's like a huge silence, and there's like that huge intensity of going through the whole process. And I think there, like we were saying, like there really needs to be that kind of like holistic, person-centered care, just to acknowledge for people like about what they're going through in like that very moment, rather than it just kind of being struck off or like, oh, this is just what it's like.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's frightening, or sometimes you potentially do get pregnant, or you get a false positive, and you don't really have anybody for that support to like talk that through. And yeah, I suppose with the fertility coaches, when they're like really motivational or like really trying to help you to conceive, it's not that option isn't available for everybody, or sometimes you don't want that perspective on it. You just want somebody like a doula to just sit with you wherever you are emotionally and be like, what would you like to happen, or to take some of that pressure off as well. I think there's definite fertility groups for LGBT fertility, and some of them are really good and really amazing if they're queer run, kind of grassroots. But I think one of the things that has been a barrier for us in accessing like proper and consistent support with people who are going through the same thing is some big organizations will have an LGBT fertility group, but it will be led by a staff member that doesn't have the lived experience of being queer, and it might be co-led with volunteers, but you would hope that because fertility support is such a needed and essential service for queer communities, because like they're completely reliant on it to potentially serve their family, that you would hope that maybe funding streams would start to see that and make it a bit of a difference in providing that specific support. So then people who do have that lived experience can then take on those roles to give more adequate support, or like safer support where you feel like you're being understood in the space. And a lot of things I think I'm finding with like running Braw Birth is because I'm not seeing a lot of fertility doula like elsewhere in the UK, and I've tried, like I have whole databases on my laptop of every LGBT organisation that I could find across the UK to let them know that Braw Birth existed. And some people don't know that like the service exists. So a lot of my work in the last year has been just trying to like raise awareness of that, so that people are aware of it. And then COVID's obviously had a huge impact of people will contact me to be like, oh, we're like really looking to try and conceive, and I'm like, okay, cool, like where are you, like how long have you been on a waiting list? And they're like, oh, well, we've not put a referral through. And then I'm kind of like, okay, well, you should probably do that. And just to let you know, the waiting list is like 2 years, so then they're kind of coming to me feeling all motivated and ready, and then you kind of have to be like, I'll maybe see you in 2 years. Or then like they're maybe going, because of the long waiting list, they're then going through more of a private route, and then they don't have the financial resources to kind of pay for that like added doula support. So I definitely think there could be changes with their perspective and funding and more awareness of why support like that is needed, but I just don't think it's properly been considered. And I think when speaking to a lot of queer families, there is still kind of that attitude of like the NHS being like, oh, well, we provided this, is this not good enough, and kind of getting quite defensive. So I don't know, I just feel like clinics don't really represent the lived experience of queer people themselves and what they need in support.
I think that's kind of how I'd thought about it in my head, but obviously I wasn't 100% sure, but that it seems more so that, like you say, queer people don't have a choice, then you can't be at home trying to get pregnant because that's not an option. But it seems like in the viewpoint of the NHS or in clinics, they're catering to like cis het couples who have maybe been trying for a couple of years and haven't got anywhere from it, and that's kind of what they've focused on, and then everyone else is like, oh yeah, you need help too, an afterthought almost.
Or I suppose one of the issues then for queer couples themselves, because sometimes there is a medical need in a queer relationship for the fertility support, and there's like a dichotomy of issue of there's some queer people that I've heard of from like Freddie McConnell's podcast, where it was a similar like coupling to like myself and my husband, where it was a trans masc partner and his female cis partner, and to get her through the funding for fertility support, they put her through all these unnecessary tests and unnecessary surgeries that she didn't need, to then be like, oh, well, yeah, now you can...
Yeah, now you're allowed.
Yeah. Or equally, there's an issue on the flip side of that, of people are like, oh, this is to a same-sex female couple, say, they're coming to support, so yeah, they'll just need IUI. We won't, like, they don't necessarily do all the medical tests, and then they're going through months and months of failed cycles, or they're not asking the right questions, and then when they ask the person that's trying to conceive or wanting to carry, hey, do you have a lot of like period pain when you have your period? And they're like, yeah, I'm in agony. And then they're like, oh, and asking more questions, or like, how regular is your cycle? And it's not necessarily every 28 to 30 days, it's maybe a longer cycle. And then they're not really picking up on a medical need, and then they're suddenly being like, oh, well, we didn't know this, but you've got PCOS, or we didn't know this, but you've got endometriosis quite extensively. And I remember, I think it was on Freddie McConnell's podcast, but I remember hearing a story of a couple where that had happened. And then again, with the clinic being so matter of fact, they'd been trying for ages and it just wasn't working and it was taking a toll. And then they did some tests and they were like, oh, you do actually have endometriosis. So they just got that shock of a diagnosis, and they literally just turned to her partner and then were like, so maybe we could try with you. And there was no thought of like how that would feel or any processing time. And I think it really like impacted them. But there's that issue of either things are far too invasive because they're trying to find a medical issue or prove that you can have the treatment, or they're not looking into things enough to fully assess you to see what treatment you need. Whereas I think things are getting better. Like before I was put into the clinic or inducted into the clinic, I went for a HICOSI test where it just looked at the health of my uterus, and they put a dye through my system to see that it went through my uterus and both my fallopian tubes. And if there had been an issue with that, then they would have been like, you're going to have to go directly through IVF. But if there's no issue, you get to go through IUI. So I found that really helpful. But then I found, when I was speaking to the therapist about that, to be like, hey, I've been asked to have this procedure, she automatically was like, you wouldn't have been asked to have that. And I was like, well, I have been. So, so I think there's like issues definitely with the NHS of being quite defensive, or just...
It's kind of like they're overlooking things based on their preconceived idea of how fertility or people struggling with fertility do look, and it's like, actually that's not how it looks for everybody. But I think you find that with a lot of things with the NHS, don't you? They have the preconceived idea of how something should look. You see it in pregnancy, in bed, and that's their way. And then if something differs or varies slightly, they're kind of scrambling to work out how to fit that into their box almost.
Yeah, like one of the issues that we had with going to the therapist, which was why we decided to stop going and to change and to pay for therapy ourselves, was we were kind of having like discussions, and it was kind of going okay for the first few sessions. And then I used to work in like the voluntary sector for an LGBT organization, and there was kind of like issues around like talking about gender recognition and how much it was needed, and us being targeted by like specific groups that were very trans exclusionary. And we were trying to speak to the therapist about trying to find a group of people that were going through like queer fertility stuff as well, so we could have that same lived experience, because they do give you resources. So we got resources on, like, because we were using a donor, stuff on, like, the Donor Conception Network, stuff on, like, children's books of how to explain to them that they are donor conceived, which I think is so essential and so important. But when we looked at all those resources, none of them were LGBT specific. None of the books looked at explaining to a child, hey, you were donor conceived because you've got two mums, or you were donor conceived because one of your parents is transgender, or you were conceived through surrogacy because of this. And they also used a donor. And when we were kind of asking around that to be like, hey, do you have anything that's LGBT specific? The therapist's attitude with us was kind of like, oh, is what I've given you not good enough? Automatically, like, on the defensive. And we were kind of, like, quite shocked. And then we were trying to explain to her, like, oh, but, like, does the Donor Conception Network have an LGBT network? Because she was kind of saying, well, you can go to their events, like, once a year they hold a national conference. And Riley was saying, like, well, I'm trans, but I'm not out as trans in all contexts of my life. And I don't really feel comfortable outing myself to dads who don't have the same lived experience, because it would be very different. And she was still kind of being quite defensive. And when I asked, hey, is there any books? Because we want to tell our child, for if we do manage to have a child, like, from the beginning, that they're donor conceived. And the foundation is great in having books that are, like, age appropriate, that go from, like, different stages, so you can continue to have those conversations throughout, like, your child's life into, like, teenhood. And they've got children's groups as well for them to connect with other donor conceived kids, so it's amazing. But when we were like, hey, would you know of any resources maybe outside of this that would explain to a child that they're donor conceived because their dad is trans or their parent is trans? And she was just like, no. And then she was like, oh, well, I was asked to be on an advisory group, but there's just too many gender identities, so we decided not to do anything. And I was like, if you think about it, there's potentially 3 if you just, like, cut them. So we were just like, this isn't for us. And when we were trying to explain, like, the safety within groups of trying to authentically be ourselves, she was just kind of, she didn't really fully understand. Or I was saying to her, like, say if I went to, like, a mum and baby group and, like, somebody said something that could potentially be quite transphobic, I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable. I would challenge it, but I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable to be like, hey, like, my husband's trans, or, like, that's part of my family makeup. And she was like, oh, but would you not want to, like, say something? Or would you? I was like, I could, but I would worry about backlash or what might happen. And it's very different from then being with other couples who have that lived experience. And we've managed to find, like, a queer families group in Glasgow, which is really helpful. But we're not pregnant yet. We've not had any children before, so we don't really feel like we can fully access it. We went to it once, and everybody was so welcoming, and it kind of made us feel confident about the fertility journey. Whereas before it felt quite exclusionary, whereas this time it felt quite good. But we kind of feel like it's not the space for us. We don't want to infringe on other people's parenting journey where they feel like they have to talk about their fertility journey with us. So, yeah, I think there's still issues around the system of it still being quite defensive. Or I think, like, the training is amazing. The nurses that we've met at the clinic have been great. Like, they know about our situation. When we were going through initial appointments on, like, the phone and stuff, they were asking us which one of us wanted to carry. So they were really inclusionary in that way. But then when we were going through, like, our paperwork for all the legal stuff, they didn't have our option of fertility down. They just had same-sex female couples.
Right.
So we had to kind of comment to be like, how we're trying to conceive isn't included. So again, it's like that little layer where you kind of feel invisible, where you feel like, oh, I feel like it's different, or I'm going to have to explain myself, or like take time in a consultation to teach somebody about something. Thankfully, that hasn't had to happen. And there has been huge differences. So like when myself and Riley were trying to conceive, or not, no, when we were first getting together, Riley was considering for like preserving his fertility, and he just didn't have like a great experience at the same clinic. They didn't know how to address his situation. They weren't respecting his pronouns. They were he said no to an internal exam because they wanted to do an internal scan, and they still kind of pushed him into that, and he felt really uncomfortable. And when we tried to speak to the therapist about that, like last year, she again was just kind of defensive. And thankfully, there does seem to be practice improvements that if you are going to the clinic, there is a specific staff team that are there for trans people themselves that are trying to conceive. But that whole experience for both of us just made us kind of stand back and wait a good 5 years before we even felt comfortable enough to go back to the clinic again to even look at going through it. And thankfully, it has been quite a positive experience so far, where we do feel like the staff do understand and they're like being quite respectful. But that mightn't be the case in like all fertility clinics. You just don't know. Like.
Yeah, it's hard. It's almost like some of them are saying there's too many intersections and we don't know how to fit into each one, so we're just not going to bother. Because and they're saying like we've got this, take it or leave it, because we don't need to cater to every single one because there's too many of you, is basically what they're saying. It's so unhelpful and so invalidating as well. I can't imagine going through everything that you've been to get to this point and then getting, like you said, to the clinic and you find that your options are not even there, and you're thinking, well, do we not exist? Do other couples like us not exist? Surely we're not the first people in this relationship, in this situation.
Yeah, but I think that's where a lot, I don't know like stats or anything, but I think a high majority of queer people will more so go down the independent route for trying to conceive, which is great. Like, I think maybe if we had thought about it and we knew that, because we'd literally put in our referral like 2 weeks before the whole pandemic happened, and I think if we'd known that was going to happen, I think we both kind of said we might have been more comfortable going through a state of finding like a donor ourselves, or potentially asking a friend, and then looking at just kind of going through that monthly cycle of being like, okay, I'm ovulating, so I'll check in with our donor and see if we can set something up to try and conceive. But I think a lot of people like, if either they've conceived completely independently, and then if doctors make assumptions about how their family has been made up and it's not necessarily true, they will just go along with that to be more comfortable, or to just have that safety for themselves. But yeah, definitely independent routes can definitely be like a huge thing. What I would say for the independent route thing is, if you can, definitely speak to a family lawyer before looking at things like that, to maybe write up agreements where potential people that you're asking to be donors, or if you're looking at surrogacy agreements, like look into the law around that and what that means, because depending on how a child is conceived can affect who is responsible for like parental rights and responsibility. And sometimes if you've not looked into that, or you're kind of jumping into it, that can kind of impact who can go on the birth certificate or who is seen as the parent. So that's something to consider. But definitely, if you're like queer and you're like worried about going through a fertility like clinic process, you don't have to do that. You can definitely set up your own arrangements if like independent fertility would feel that bit better for you as well.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to know, because I think for a lot of people that probably feels like the easier option, but then it's all of the legal stuff. You've got to do it yourself. You're completely responsible for all of that stuff, and you've got to make sure that that's down to a T, so that nothing comes up at a later date and makes that even more stressful.
Yeah. And obviously with say with like going through a clinic as well, everything is kind of regulated. So like everything about my body is screened and made sure that it's healthy, and everything about the donor that we've chosen, I know that they've been fully screened and are at like peak health. And then obviously, because you've used a donor, there's things around being put on a register then. So your child, obviously like all the donor registers are completely anonymous, but once your child is 16, they can access certain information about potential donor siblings that they may have, like across the UK or across Scotland. And then once they're 18, they can access like information about their donor if they would like to contact their donor to potentially meet or find out more. So there is that kind of added security, and there is that added security of that separation of potentially somebody not trying to like intervene or like you know, that it's all very boundaried and regulated, and like it's very strict. Like if we ever move house, or if we were ever to like change our like names or whatever, we have to go back and let the clinic know, so everything is kind of interconnected, so that they can keep track, and so that our child has full access to know who their donor was if they would like to.
Oh wow, that's really interesting, because I wouldn't have even considered any of that stuff. But I guess it's from that point of view, if you're going through the clinics and stuff, you don't have to worry about it at all. It's just it's kind of like it's one less thing that you've got to consider what's already a lot of things to consider.
And you know that it's regulate. Not that I think, well, there are certain documentaries of like scandals that have happened with. I'll find out the name and I'll let you know for the podcast. There are certain documentaries of like scandals that have happened of people being like, "Oh, I'll be a donor for you," and then they've actually like impregnated quite a lot of people, and it's not been very regulated. But with the UK law, I think a donor can only they have to stop being a donor after they've had a certain amount of like successful pregnancies.
So if
they impregnated 10 people, then they can't be a donor anymore. But like when I was doing so, I like did a course with UCL, like the University College London, on fertility stuff, and there was a lot of talk on like donors and the legality of that, and there are some forums where people are offering to be donors for people just in more of that independent way, and it just seemed a bit sus to me, because obviously anonymity can be like important, but one of the people that they were talking to that puts themselves forward for being a donor, they were talking about how it shouldn't necessarily be regulated. They didn't really see an issue. They should have contact with the child if they want. So you just want to be a bit careful, and you also potentially don't want to get into situations where people are like asking or pressuring you for money, or then trying to get overly involved in your family, particularly if they're complete strangers.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's why things like those registers can really help. So if you are thinking of going down the independent route, just be very careful about who you are thinking of asking, or how you're conceiving as well, because there's like jokes going around of like, oh, we're a same-sex couple or whatever makeup, but if I have a one-night stand with that person and I get pregnant, then great, we've got a baby. But legally, if you have sex through intercourse and conceive, that third person that mightn't be part of your relationship is then the legal parent of that child that has that responsibility, and sometimes people don't think of that, so that can impact like legal stuff down the line. So there's like pros and cons of going down the clinical route or looking at independent fertility. It's just about being careful and putting provisions in for yourself, I think.
I guess again that's one of the things that you can help with, isn't it? So like if people are on this journey, then that's something that people can come to you with and say like, I'm considering this, but this is putting me off. What are the alternatives, and would that be better? And you can help make that decision that way, because I think a lot of people wouldn't consider the things like you said. Like I've heard people say, like, make those sort of jokes that they could just go and find somebody, but then you don't want that person on the birth certificate or turning up on your door like, where's my kid?
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it's just about having that added like safety. So it's about potentially speaking to like a good family lawyer who'll just be able to help you either understand the ramifications of like decisions or routes that you decide to take, or they'll help you write up legal agreements that you can get the person that's potentially going to be a donor, or if you have surrogacy agreements to sign. Because also for surrogacy, say in the UK, it's actually not legal for you to ask somebody to be your surrogate. You can't ask anybody. They have to offer independently to be your surrogate, and you can't pay them any money. You can pay general expenses like say like travel to and from hospital appointments, and you can pay for things like say like food if they're going to get meals and stuff, or travel, or like say like clothing expenses if they're then going to have to buy certain maternity clothing, but it's illegal for you to pay them. It has to be a completely independent offer that they're offering to do, and on those circumstances generally it does have to be done through a fertility clinic, so it is kind of regulated. But a lot of people don't think about that as well, and there have been like fraudulent cases where people will say, hey, I'll be a surrogate for you, and then they're just trying to con people out of money, and that's why it's become much more regulated. And being like, I think, I'm not entirely sure about the law, but there's like issues in America with like surrogacy tourism, where a lot of American couples will contact people in India and ask them to carry for them in exchange for quite a lot of money. And then these women, because it's not necessarily socially acceptable, they may already have families themselves, will agree to these things, go through processes to try and get pregnant, and then they'll have to go and kind of stay in like kind of like a women's house or like a women's refuge, and they stay there in secrecy for their whole pregnancy, and they get like maternity care with doctors and stuff, and they get like social support and like kind of community connectedness. But then they'll give birth, and then they'll then go back to their families from wherever they're from, and they might then be able to have a lot of money to like set up a business or help like other generations in their family. But it's very secret, and there's no regulation on the payment. So when I was studying that through my fertility course, there was like clips from documentaries of women in these houses or support services being like, well, this person is getting paid like thousands of pounds more than me, and I'm only getting this much. And it just can become quite exploitative.
Yeah.
So in the UK, you're not necessarily, it's kind of illegal for you to go down that route as well. So there's so many things that people just don't understand about fertility that you kind of just assume or take for granted, where it's really good to really look into things and think about it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's so interesting. I'd never heard of anything like that. Like especially what you just said about America with the women in India.
Also, for like surrogacy as well, probably good to mention that you don't have parental rights for that child, and the surrogate does. So once they give birth, and particularly if they are married or in a civil partnership, they themselves and their partner have parental rights and responsibility for that child once it's born. And then you then have to sign over parental orders for the couple who are intending to like parent the child or look after the child. That's when it all kind of becomes legal. But you don't actually have any parental rights until those legal things have been signed over, and they have to be done within a certain amount of time. I can't necessarily remember, but it's within a few weeks of the birth, and if it's not done within that time, then the surrogate would still hold like all the parental rights and responsibilities. So there's so many things that you would just think, this is like our social arrangement, but so much stuff on the legal side you need to really think and consider before you pick the best route for yourself, I suppose.
Yeah, that's wild. Because I've spoken about being a surrogate before. I've never looked into it properly, but my best friend is gay, and we've just spoke about it. Like, if he wants to be a child, I was like, I will 100% be a surrogate. I love being pregnant and giving birth. And I've literally, but in my head, I'm like, I'll just go get pregnant, pop out this baby, and give you it, as if it's that simple. And now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, of course it's not that simple. So stupid. But in my head, I've just been like, yeah, I'll have a baby for you, no big deal.
But that's like the right track because you've offered.
But yeah, at least I've offered.
It wouldn't be legal.
Yeah, no, he's never asked me. Well, it's in conversation, but I've offered. It's not. But I've never. Yeah, in my head, I've always just been like, yeah, I'll pop a baby out, no big deal. So before I let you go, because we've been talking quite a while, but I do want to ask if you would sort of talk on the impact of the fertility experience on people who then do go on to get pregnant and obviously giving birth, and then even into sort of postpartum, into their parenthood journey, if you wouldn't mind chatting on that.
So we kind of chatted a bit about it like for our chat, but like a lot of the kind of lived experience or what I hear or what I see from like anthologies of like queer fertility is like people don't really know where they fit once they get pregnant.
Yeah.
They don't really fit in the trying to conceive groups anymore, or they feel like they can't talk about their pregnancy in those groups. And they don't really fit in the people that maybe have never talked about how they've conceived or have seemed to conceive quite easily. So you kind of feel like you don't really know where you stand. And they're like, I think it's such a big phenomenon that there is certain podcasts on it of like the kind of there's one I think called the Finally Pregnant podcast, and it's about that whole area of like having that space for people to be like, yeah, I went through fertility and it took however long, and it's a very different experience. And in having like a lot of perinatal anxiety, particularly when the first trimester, is very, very common. But again, nobody really talks about it. So people just think that they're going mad, or like, or I must be so ungrateful that I feel this way and I shouldn't feel this way. I should feel really happy that I'm pregnant. But it's like, it is very, very common to kind of have that as well. When people talk about kind of going into the maternity system or like pregnancy and birth, people can already say like they feel burnt out or exhausted by the time the baby has come because they've gone through maybe years of treatment, or they just feel wiped out, or now that the whole experience has kind of ended, maybe symptoms of like PTSD, both from fertility experience and pregnancy or birth, can kind of start to seep in. And I think that's kind of common. Having a lot of fear around pregnancy and birth is a huge thing. I know I've not necessarily supported people, but obviously I follow a lot of people who've been through fertility to get pregnant, and I've kind of followed their journey, and then they've talked about going in for their like C-section or going in for their birth, and they're constantly anxious throughout the whole experience. Or one woman I spoke to said that she was just in like tears and constantly having panic attacks throughout her birth because she thought that something was going to go wrong and her baby was going to die, and nobody within the medical team was kind of equipped to understand why that might be happening. Or because nobody talks about it, there was other people talking about like, well, I'm going in for my planned C-section tomorrow, but I'm so anxious that something's going to happen. And it is very normal to feel like that because you've gone through this whole huge journey potentially to get to that point, and you are kind of potentially constantly worried that something's going to happen. And with potentially going through fertility journeys, you are kind of put more in the high, not necessarily because there is a high risk, but it's kind of just this immediate route thing where you are just put in that kind of route of like, so you're already kind of being, not micromanaged, but every little thing about your pregnancy then is like under a microscope. So that can obviously impact things. There's a lack of like adequate antenatal education that incorporates preconception and fertility. There's that lack of peer support, particularly if you're kind of doing it by yourself, where you're not really talking about the fact that you're going through fertility support. Again, we talked about it like just that thing with that whole attitude of just like, but you should just be happy that you're pregnant.
Yeah.
And some people just don't know how to respond to that, or they do feel happy, but then they feel all this other range of emotions, and then there's no real way or appropriate person to like process that with. Obviously, yeah, we talked about like high risk of like mental health, and like peri, like and postnatal mental health. Yeah, you kind of like not feeling connected or wanting to be involved with other people potentially after the birth. I know that can kind of happen if you kind of either feel kind of disconnected after the birth, you have like that guilt that you're not really connecting with your baby, or the opposite can happen. And I've seen that happen where potentially people have contacted me because they are pregnant and they were more so looking for postnatal support, which I can't provide. So I pass them on to other doulas that I know. And then when I was speaking to them about like, oh, like how are things going, there was this like anxiety around it of not wanting the doula support or not wanting the doula to come into the house, or I knew that they were potentially really struggling with like feeding or knowing how to feed, and I knew that they really wanted to breastfeed. But then they were like, they didn't want people to come into the house, and COVID had a huge impact in feeling so anxious that something was going to happen to the baby. So sometimes I think for doula work as well, it can bring up a lot of barriers that if doulas aren't making those connections with how it might be connected to the preconception phase, it can be quite difficult then for like a pregnancy doula or a postpartum doula to effectively work or kind of build up that trust with people.
Yeah.
I think that can kind of happen as well. And then, yeah, like, I suppose, yeah, the final thing is like just finding it hard to accept that support, or you finally feel like your baby's here, or like the things that people talk about after pregnancy of if you've got a lot of visitors and stuff coming over that you don't really feel like you've got the time with your baby or that connectedness either. It can kind of feel exhausting in that way, yeah.
That's really interesting. I'd never considered that I think you sort of accept that, yeah, maybe people might struggle to connect, but you don't think about it the other way, that it might be completely that you're so over protected because it's been such a journey to get there that you don't want anyone around. You can't fathom having anyone else hold this baby because you finally got them, and it's like no one else can come into that. You don't want anything, things that had already been going wrong for so long that you no longer necessarily maybe have that trust that actually things are okay now and things will be okay. I'd never even considered that, so I'm really glad you brought that up, because I wouldn't have even thought about that.
Yeah, I think like something that I've noticed as well because it's why I started to develop the queer antenatal education, but something that I did notice was when, say, pregnant people were contacting me to be like, hey, we're looking for this kind of support, or I'm really struggling with how I'm feeling in my pregnancy, is they're kind of catching up with themselves in like trying to process the whole fertility experience, and then either they're trying to access mainstream antenatal support and they're not really feeling like it's for them, or it's causing them a lot of anxiety, or they don't really feel like they fit. Like some people have spoken to me about potentially in their fertility journey they've had a miscarriage or a loss along the way, and then when they're, well, maybe again it's around that issue of potentially people not speaking about it, but then when they're around all these other people that are so excited in their own pregnancy, they're like, well, I don't feel excited. I feel constantly worried that I'm going to lose this baby and I'm not going to feel okay until they're here. And that could be a huge issue. And what I was finding with some couples, they would contact me and they would be like, oh, well, we're due in like 6 weeks, but we don't know how to feed a baby. We don't know how to, like, we don't know anything about safe sleep, because they've kind of like stuck in trying to process all this fertility stuff, and then they're kind of on the back burner of having that confidence in their own parenting and their own postpartum care, which I think can be an issue as well.
Yeah, it completely makes sense, doesn't it? Like if you've spent so long trying to get to this point and then you're finally in it, you are going to be really consumed in that experience and not necessarily consider what comes after, and then all of a sudden be shell-shocked, like, because I mean, for anybody, having a baby is a massive life-changing event. You're like, what the hell do I do with this tiny human? But especially if you've not had that sort of 9 months to sit and consider it, like other people have, other people who haven't struggled with anything beforehand can spend that time thinking, let's do some birth prep, let's do some postpartum prep. But if you're not in that headspace, then it must be such a shock, like such a huge shock to be like, well, what do I do now?
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Before I let you go, do you want to share where people can find you and what workshops you do run? Obviously, I'll put everything in the show notes, but if you just want to let people know.
Yeah, so my website is Braw Birth, so BRAW Birth, .co.uk, and I run workshops, stuff looking at like navigating your options and the system as a queer person, so kind of a lot of stuff we talked about today, stuff around building better boundaries as well in your fertility and pregnancy, so that you kind of feel safe and secure of the information that you're sharing, and you don't feel like people are like making demands on you, and it's kind of all on your terms, because I think that can kind of be forgotten, or people can kind of either give unsolicited advice or ask quite intrusive questions that you wouldn't necessarily want to answer, or people just don't think about certain things when they're asking either about pregnancy or fertility. And the third workshop that I run is stuff around fatness, queerness and fertility, because there's huge issues around BMI barriers, and then that impacts your like access to fertility treatment, and then the compounding thing of if you're a queer person and that's your only route to trying to conceive, and then fertility clinics are just turning you away and then completely ignoring you, even if you have been on a route, until you're actually at that point of being at what they consider a healthy BMI. They just won't contact you again. It's kind of left completely up to you to get things, quote unquote, like back on track. So it kind of looks at the intersections of that, of fatness and fertility within the queer community, and how to look at that, how to have a healthier approach, and how you might respond to it, or looking at the issues of like weight cycling and dieting, and how that can impact your like mental health. So a key person I think to really look at that is Nicola Salmon. She's a fertility coach, but she does like fat positive fertility coaching, and she's got like books out, and she's just started her own podcast, so she'd know a hell of a lot more about it than me. But quite a few people were asking me to do a workshop or do a specific focus on that, so that's where my workshops kind of come in. But she does amazing work on that if people are really interested or really struggling with that kind of barrier. Obviously with the fertility doula packages, I offer packages of like 3, 6, 12 and 18 months of support. It's all completely bespoke. It can be quite flexible, or we can look at the different things that you would want to do. For like the more smaller ones, so for like the 3 and 6 month one, the 3 month I would meet with you every week for an hour, and then be there for like the added support of like appointments, doing added research for you, providing resources, those kind of things. The 6 month one I meet with you every fortnight, and then the 12 and 18 month we would meet monthly, but all the like added things of the physical care, all the informational care as well is all included. I also offer queer pregnancy doula support as well, so supporting you throughout your pregnancy with antenatal education, helping you set up your birth plan, and then obviously being on call for your birth. I offer a postpartum visit, but I can't physically offer postpartum care, but I do have good connections obviously across the UK of like amazing postpartum doulas. And then the kind of I suppose then I also offer the queer antenatal education, and I've got that coming up in January as well, for people who maybe want a very queer focused kind of course. And then I also offer training to doulas in being more aware of their support response to the preconception phase, and how it then can impact like pregnancy, birth and postpartum. And I've got some training dates coming up for that for like mid-January as well.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. I'll put the links to everything in the show notes so people can find that. And thank you so much for coming on. I feel like I've learned so much, so I think that everyone listening is going to feel exactly the same. I've really enjoyed talking to you, so thank you for coming and sharing your time. And everything that you offer just sounds so wonderful and so needed as well.
Thank you for inviting me on. I've really enjoyed it as well.
So that concludes our chat on queer fertility support. I hope that you found it helpful, and again, a huge thank you to Deva for coming onto the podcast and sharing her time and massive wealth of knowledge. Please do check out the show notes for links to all of her work. If you're currently on your own fertility journey, then I'm sending you lots of love, and please do reach out to Deva if you feel that you would like some support. If you have any more questions, then come hang out on Instagram where I'm at the Dungaree Doula and Deva is at Braw_Birth, and let us know if you enjoyed the episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do stick around, like, follow and subscribe, or even leave a little review if you don't mind. That would be very helpful. Speak soon. Bye.